Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. I'm your host, Nozi Pombandra. Thank you for making the time to join us. Now, Africa feeds Europe. This is a strange headline indeed, and one that you're unlikely to see or even heard. But the reality is that 40% of the food leaving Africa ends up on European tables. Sounds counterproductive, right? After all, is Africa not portrayed as the continent of the starving in need of foreign aid to survive? Well, that's a portrait that should be changing. With large amounts of untapped arable land, Africa's agricultural trade is projected to be worth $1 trillion as soon as 2030. Joining me now to discuss what arguably could be called the greatest challenge of the 21st century from London is Dr. Didier Carton. He is the head of Traces and Director General for Health and Consumers at the European Commission. Didier, thank you for making the time to join us. Maybe let's just get first a stance from you in terms of the state of agricultural investment in Europe before we get a comparative analysis of what this looks like with regards to Africa.
Hi. Just to talk about Traces as you presented, and what I would like to talk about, this system is in direct relation with all the food action that can be done with EU and even a bit forward, not only EU but at the regional level. This is a free IT system that is designed to make all the certification for any movement of live animals, of product of animal origin to EU or within EU. So let me talk about a bit of the history, because it's quite interesting regarding what can happen in Africa. At the very beginning, it was a single market in EU. And this system was designed just to allow a free circulation of live animals and products within this single market. And in the same time, we developed the protection of this single market with the control at the border. And afterward, we considered that it would be very, very useful to develop relation and to strengthen all the relationship we have got with our partner, and especially with Africa and with all the countries of Africa. And so that's the reason why we develop a specific module just to allow any third country to make online its own certificate, and just to avoid any administrative burden and to speed up all the administrative process when these goods are arriving at the border. And now what we are developing is to give the possibility to this country in Africa, because if it is the same as EU, and we believe so, that the most interesting is to make the trade between themselves. And we developed this, what we call the regional module, to give the possibility to this country to use the system for their own purposes internally with Africa. And this is in relation with the African Union. We try to develop something on the basis of the regional economic community that exists at the level of the African Union. And this is just to facilitate the trade. So within the food. Okay.
Didier, let me just intervene there and maybe get a sense from you whether these efforts have resulted in an improvement in the quality of agricultural produce that you're seeing from African markets.
As soon as you gave regarding the quality, of course, this tool participates to facilitate the trade. And as soon as there is some niche that can be opened with this facilitation of the trade, it will improve the quality of what is going to be exported. And there is a direct impact. So, but first of all, it's just to try to remove all these barriers that can exist when countries want to export. And just to give you some facts regarding traces. And traces is a scope today, and we expect to extend the scope, but it's concerning live animals. So for Africa, exporting to EU is very, very limited. But regarding food and a product of animal origin, the main product exported at that time is a fish product. It represents about 85% of everything exported to EU, and 80% of the country, because we have got 16 African countries that are using traces for their own export. It is half of the country that are exporting the type of product covered by traces, and this is quite interesting because 80% of every trade, every export is done now within traces. But what we try to do is just to have an improvement, but not only to export to EU, but at the regional level, to give this possibility to aggregate more than these 16 countries. The remaining exporting country, of course, but as well the 54 countries that exist in Africa.
Allow me to intervene once more, and perhaps just to put another risk factor on the table, in particular talking about the outbreak of Ebola in Africa. We've seen this also infiltrate into Europe now. To what extent is this going to be impacting on the agricultural trade relations that exist between the two continents?
I'm not going to talk about Ebola because it is something that is not at all foodborne disease or something like that. You pointed out something very, very interesting is why we developed that in Europe. It is following a sanitary crisis. It was not the Ebola, which is human beings related, but it is regarding classical swine fever and foot and mouth disease. That are diseases that exist in Africa. And this type of system, with all the notification that can be done and with the follow-up and the tracing back and forth of all the movement is very useful to react as quick as possible when there is a sanitary crisis. And this is why we developed that, and for the benefit of the single market in EU. And this is what we try to promote within a single market, within a REC in Africa, or within Africa in totality. We can have the dream that maybe Africa in 20 years will look like what we have got at that time in EU with a single market. And the system, and this system is here just to trace back and forth and to react as quick as possible when there is a sanitary crisis and for whatever. But Ebola has nothing to do with the export today, and just to jeopardize any kind of food export, and especially because it is located in countries that are not exporting too much. But this is nothing to do with the animal health or public health disease concern with the exchange of food.
Didier, let's talk about the citrus black spot, in particular emanating from the South African market and the concerns that have been raised from the European side in terms of the quality of that agricultural produce. What is the future of citrus products coming from South Africa into Europe? Do you get a sense that these tensions are going to be overcome and normal resumption of trade will continue?
Yeah. Okay. Regarding that disease, for the time being, we don't have the plant within the system. Is only the live animals and product of animal origin, but it is something that it is going to be extended. Regarding what is going to happen with the product that are concerned with that disease there is a prohibition right now, but prohibition in relation with the efforts that will be done with the eradication and so on by South Africa. It is something that could be changed in the future. But I cannot tell you what is going to really happen at that time, except the fact that all the exports of the product are blocked according to that disease.
Didier, thank you for making the time to join us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have with Dr. Didier Carton. Again, we'll thank him for his time. It is time for us here in Johannesburg to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to be tapping into the resource that is Africa's food sector. Don't go away. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Now, tonight we're talking about investing in food production. Remember that we do value your suggestions and your feedback. So send us an email. That's to investafrica@abn360.com, or talk to us on Twitter by using the handle @CNBC Africa, and the hashtag is Invest Africa. And of course, you can follow me @Nozi Pombandra. Now, at the recent IMF and the World Bank annual meetings in Washington, I spoke to Nigeria's Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development, Akinwumi Adesina. Let's take a look at that conversation.
Well, first and foremost, if you look at what Africa is spending on food, for me it doesn't make sense. We're spending $35 billion a year importing food, and we have a lot of water, we have cheap labor, we have great land all across the African economy. So what we should be doing is actually producing our own food and become a global powerhouse in food. And so you look also at the size of the food and agribusiness sector on the continent. That's going to be $1 trillion by 2030. And you look at the foreign direct investment that's going to go into this sector, it's going to rise to $45 billion by 2020. So you got to pay attention to this space. And that's what we decided to do in Nigeria, that we're going to turn agriculture into a big wealth creating sector. And what we did first and foremost is made a decision that agriculture is not a development activity. It is not a social sector. It is a business. It's a mega business. And we decided to do that. And the government will get out of the way. Government will do the basic things it should do: good policies, good institutions, infrastructure, and public goods. But let the private sector drive this, the engine of growth, and that's what we have done. We've been able to attract $5.6 billion of private sector investments into this space within 3 years. We've been able to reach our farmers with access to improved seeds and fertilizers at scale of 14 million farmers, within a period of 3 years, all via their mobile phones. And the number of seed companies have expanded from 5 to 80 in 3 years. And $5 billion of investment in fertilizer manufacturing. And the banks are making money, the farmers are making money. So really, the key is agriculture is a business. Right. And it's time that Africa wakes up to that and recognizes that smallholder farmers have to make a lot of money, and the best way to do it is to unlock the potential of agriculture that many of them depend on.
Did this necessitate a change in the way we think about financing agriculture, and in particular on the part of the banks and the development finance institutions that had to step in and plug in where there were gaps?
Well, first and foremost, the banks are not philanthropic organizations. They're not going to lend unless it is profitable to do so. What we've done was that we've shown it's actually viable and highly profitable for them to do so. I'll take the case of rice, for example, in Nigeria. When I had to convince Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man, to invest in rice, I got to have my numbers right. We showed him very clearly that the internal rate of return to investing in rice is about 35 to 42%. And the payback period for it is only 2 years. And so, he didn't just become the richest man by being dumb. He looked at it very closely, and he said, I'm not going to invest $300 million, which is what he wanted to invest before. Today he's investing $1 billion into that. And so what I'm saying is that investment assessment, making that available to investors is very, very critical.
And how do we replicate this success story into other African markets?
Well, first is that I think, we are sharing quite a lot of experiences with many other countries. If you take, for example, the case of the electronic wallet system, where we were able to end corruption in seed and fertilizer sector in Nigeria, a corruption of 40 years. It took us exactly 90 days to end that. And we now distribute, we reach our farmers with seeds and fertilizers, and today now we also do for mechanized services over their mobile phones, which we call electronic wallet. In 3 years, we've reached 14 million farmers. Just think about it. It's massive. And so now we're reaching out and helping other countries like Kenya, Tanzania, like Uganda, many other countries, Rwanda, and so on, that want to take the Nigerian model into their own countries. And in fact, the World Bank has actually agreed that they will help scale up the Nigerian electronic wallet system into these other countries. And we're getting requests all the way from India to also China and Brazil about it. So I think, just think about it. Nigeria is now exporting transparency, and for me, that's pretty cool.
Joining us from Lagos is Kola Masha. He is the CEO of Dorio Partners. Kola, thank you for making the time to join us. Now, one of the key things that the minister says there right at the top of that interview is that the agricultural sector in Nigeria has gone through a brand revolution, and it's no longer seen as a development activity. From your point of view, does this mirror what you're seeing on the ground, and is the investment flowing in that regard?
Well, I think definitely what you've seen over the last 3 to 4 years is a recognition by the private sector that the agriculture sector is a place you can actually invest in and get a good return. If you look at from the flows into the agriculture sector from the commercial banking sector, I think back in 2011, about 1.5% of their loan book went into the sector. Today, I believe the most recent numbers are showing that we have 4 or 5% of the loan book of commercial banks going into the sector. Some banks like First City Monument Bank, FCMB, they've got up to 10% of their loan book going into the agriculture sector.
What kind of interventions are we seeing on the ground on the part of smallholder farmers to make sure that the business case for investment at that level is strengthened?
Well, I think the reality is that a lot of investments tend to focus more on setting up their own commercial farms and so on and so forth. I think the reality, though, is that over time we need to see more and more people starting to invest in smart ways with smallholder farmers. I think that's one of the key things that, as an organization, we exclusively focus on. All of our investments are such that we invest in a manner that is profitable, but also ensures that we're able to increase the profitability of small-scale farmers.
To a large extent, when we look at the growth of the retail sector across the continent, we oftentimes forget to talk about smallholder farmers who are at the far end of that particular value chain. Are we seeing an integrated approach to financing agriculture that would be inclusive of all the stages that when a piece of produce, for example, moves from the ground to the point where it's sitting on a shelf?
Well, the reality is that traditionally people have found it very difficult to finance smallholder farmers because they, unlike larger organizations, they don't have the traditional collateral that banks and other institutions would look for. I think that's one of the reasons why one of the key things we've done is invest in a model we call an agricultural franchise, where effectively we de-risk smallholder farmers by looking at other ways besides traditional collateral to protect capital flows to them. And I think by the end of 2015, we'll be providing somewhere in the range of about $5 million in financing directly to smallholder farmers. And we're running right now at about a 99.8% repayment rate.
And of course, on the other hand, Kola, there's always been the case for development finance institutions to plug the gap, in particular, not only around financing, but also offering the skills such as business acumen and training around how to increase productivity for smallholder farmers. Are we seeing this actually happening and moving away from sort of textbook rhetoric to something that is a reality on the ground?
Well, I think the biggest challenge with a lot of that technical assistance that has come to smallholder farmers is that it's been provided almost in isolation. And one of the critical things that we've recognized is that the reality is, if you look at many other sectors, that if the user of the technology needs to understand how to use that technology, traditionally that comes through the same channel that the technology itself comes through. So basically what I'm saying is the seller of the technology is one that delivers the knowledge about how to use that. If you look at the agriculture sector, what we've seen, and one of the challenges, that's been disconnected. You have development projects or government projects that are focusing on delivering that type of information, and that might work in a short time frame, but the reality is over a longer time frame, the individuals delivering that knowledge don't have the right incentives to ensure that the farmers are adopting that technology and adopting those learnings. So reality is, the smart companies are integrating that type of activity, that training and development of their customer base directly into what they do every day.
Let's maybe look at the infrastructure around agriculture, and in particular whether we are seeing that improving to ensure that in addition to productivity, we're also having higher yields that can bring higher returns, not only to the farmers, but for all of those invested.
Well, I think a lot of the activity that the government's been working on is really trying to fix some of the underlying structural challenges that are inhibiting access to technology to the farmers, particularly seeds. I think is one of the first major steps that's been taken, with the deregulation of the seed industry, particularly in Nigeria, and that's enabled large players to come in with the right type of technology. Now, I think that deregulation needs to take one step further and probably allow these players to start coming in. Start by importing the technology, building up the market before they're forced to actually invest in processing facilities. But specifically on infrastructure itself, it's still, we haven't quite seen a lot of there's a lot of plans, but as far as direct implementation on the ground, I think those are still to come. The reality is the number one thing that the government should focus on an infrastructure standpoint is rural roads. If time and time again, study after study has demonstrated, if you just invest in ensuring you build good rural roads, you dramatically reduce the cost of technology coming in for the farmers and the cost of those farmers being able to access markets and get their products out into those markets.
From a policy perspective, Kola, and in particular looking at land policy, which is an integral part of having a really productive agricultural sector, what are the major trends that we're seeing in land policy around Nigeria, and are those trends in favor for investment in the sector?
Well, the reality is land is a tricky subject in Nigeria. The reality is that the way that the policies is written is that in theory the federal government owns a significant portion of the land, but in reality the communities that have been using this land for decades, if not centuries, really at the end of the day are the real owners of that. So if you're a large investor who wants to come in and get access to large amounts of land, yes, you start by working with government, but in turn, government has to then turn around and work with the communities to get you access to that. And the truth of the matter is that Nigeria has 84 million hectares of arable land, but we have 160 million people. If you look on a per capita per rural inhabitant, in 1960, Nigeria had 2 hectares per person. Today it's 0.9 hectares. By 2030, due to erosion, salinization, desertification, so on and so forth, that's going to go down to about half a hectare per person. So the reality is Nigeria already feels significant land pressure and will likely continue to see land pressure as population continues to grow. So the short answer to that question is that on the land side, what you want to do, the smart investors want to figure out how to work with smallholder farmers who are already have access to that land and informally within the communities have clear understanding of the title of that land.
Absolutely. Maybe let's also talk about the opportunities for the integration of women into this particular economic activity. Do you get a sense that there are any concerted efforts from a policy perspective, once again, to ensure that women are recognized as workers of the land in agriculture and therefore benefit substantially from the growth that we're seeing in the sector?
Well, from a policy standpoint, I know that the government has a desire. I'm not aware of any specific women-friendly policies that have been outlined. There may be some out there, but the reality is that we have inherent cultural challenges when it comes to women and agriculture in Nigeria. The truth is we work with a lot of female farmers. Over 20% of the farmers that we work with are women. And what we find is that these women tend to have, first and foremost, the land that they have access to. They typically get that from their husbands. And that land is much smaller than the average farmer and tends to actually be far worse land. So we've actively developed a system in which we're actually in the process of scaling up now, where we can work with these female farmers to regenerate these degraded soils and get the organic soil content of this land up so it can start being much more productive. And through those, through investing in that land effectively, they can eventually over time start to grow. And we've seen that with several of the female farmers we work with. One year they'll have 0.2, 0.3 hectares. The next year they'll make enough money to move to 0.5 hectares and eventually 1 hectare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And finally, we heard the minister earlier speaking about how Aliko Dangote has committed about $1 billion into the sector. From a private equity perspective, Kola, where are the opportunities in agriculture?
Well, firmly, we believe the number one opportunity in the agriculture sector is within the protein value chain, particularly within the poultry value chain. If you look at any developing market, the agriculture sector that grows fast, subsector I should say, that grows fastest is the protein value chain, because as people get wealthier, then their diet shifts to include a much larger percentage of protein. Take China, for example. In 1966, they had about 7 kilograms per person per capita. By 2003, that had gone up to over 50 kilograms per person per capita. In Hong Kong, it's close to 90 kilo per person per capita. And so that's a standard trend that you see. And one of the more exciting spaces, as I mentioned, was the poultry, even a subsector of that area, because the reality in markets like Nigeria, what you see is that over time, poultry becomes the dominant source of protein, because at the end of the day, it's one of the most efficient forms of producing protein.
Kola, thank you for making the time to join us. And that unfortunately brings us to the end of tonight's episode. Don't forget to send us your comments. The details are on your screen. Right now, Bruce Whitfield is standing by to bring you Tonight with Bruce. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye for now.